All right, so we're going to get started with Mao's Economic and Social Policies Part 2. This is where we're going to be looking at religious policies. So some communists view religion as a capitalist invention that serves to keep the classes divided so that the rich elites can continue to exploit the poor. Not all communists view this religion as such. We will see some examples in the future next semester with the Cold War when we see, for example, a lot of Latin American, Central Americans, and even in Cuba, liberation theology, where they're using the teachings of Christianity to kind of push for more equality and, eliminating class division. Uh, in Mao's China, religion was seen as a poison, so therefore it had to be eliminated and replaced with the idea of party loyalty instead, which would then lead to loyalty to your country, then would lead to the betterment of your country. Pro-capitalist churches, Christian churches, were targeted, forced to close down. If you refused, if you resisted any of this, which a lot of did, you basically were attacked. Propaganda against these religions were blasted. The practice of Buddhism, it wasn't just Christianity. You see this with Buddhism, you see this with Confucianism, was banned. So it's not like outside religions, because Christianity did not originate in China, but other religions that are more have originated more in the continent of Asia were also banned. They were not allowed to basically be open about it for a while, at least if you belong to those pro-capitalist churches that were preaching that pro-capitalist mentality. Religious ceremonies were replaced with political party meetings. It's not to say that you couldn't have religious ceremonies anymore, but again, if you were part of that pro-capitalist church, then yes, you probably were banned, especially because um, a lot of these churches preached that old mentality. Okay, next one. This did not mean that all churches were banned. Some were allowed to stay if they did not preach that old mentality, that old feudal system, romanticized it, or endangered the country in any way. These churches were labeled as patriotic churches, and they had to give their open support to the communist government. The changes with these led with tension with the Vatican. If you know anything about the Vatican, it's like the central point, the focal point of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church rejected all of this, rejected the patriotic churches and anything going on. Any church that accepted this in China was basically like not recognized. During the Cultural Revolution, religion was attacked as one of the four olds and pro-capitalist. And one region, I know Christianity seems like it's the only example we're using right now, but it was not. If you remember Tibet, the Tibetan monks in Tibet and Xiangxi, which is a region that is heavily populated even today with Muslims. Tibet attempting to keep their old feudal system is why there was tension. So remember, they wanted to keep that old caste system, the feudal system, with landlords and exploitation of those individuals in Jiangxi, as well as other regions like in other religions such as Christianity in China, the Muslim population, obviously with Xiangxi, Confucianism, and the Tibetan system with the monks also had, rejected this new norm because a lot of them were rejecting the reforms that made women equal. Okay. So basically, that's what we see, why we see part of the tension rising. What about women, though? So, what is it that's causing tension? Well, again, equality, giving equality to extending that equality to women and their families, right? So, before Mao, China had been a patriarchal society. That means dominated by men. They're calling all the shots, they're making up all the rules, they're enforcing all the rules, they're making sure that this is happening. And so, men were elevated, right? Seen as better, seen as the you know the better gender, I guess, if that's what I want to say. And women were seen as less. Therefore, there was more restriction on women, and they were more seen as property rather than actual human beings or individuals, right? So it wasn't just, like I said, it wasn't just Christianity or the Muslim population that was kind of thinking this way. It was also, the Buddhists in Tibet and the Confucian religion as well, pushed women to obey their husbands blindly. So whatever your husband says or whatever the man in the house says, that's what you have to follow. This system pushed by religion practices of the past had women engaging in this thing called foot binding and other practices as well. So foot binding, it sounds like a very painful process, and I'm sure it is because it requires women to break their feet so at a young age so that their feet start to mold into like to resemble a lotus flower because small feet by men in China were seen as attractive. And so this was a very painful practice. And even if, as a woman, if you did not want to do this, sometimes your family was forcing you to do this because it's like, oh, you have to seem desirable for a man. And therefore, we have to start breaking this child who can't consent because they don't even know what the heck this is, what's like, what the concept of this is. You know, they're breaking the families are breaking their feet of these people. Additionally, women were forced into marriages and sold into them too. You were priced. If you were a woman, you were priced depending on how many children you could have. It's not like you can predict, but it's like, oh, this woman is young and her hips look a certain way, and like, because she's young and because her family has a history of having a lot of kids, this woman can probably produce a lot of kids. So therefore, we're going to charge a lot more money. Versus this woman, oh, she's like at the end of her youth. She's already old, and like, we're going to give you a discount. So this is what I mean, that women were seen as property, a bargaining chip versus individuals. It was also tradition for men to have one wife, but to keep multiple women as mistresses. So it's like you have one woman, but like you have 5 other or 10 other, like a bunch of other women. The wife could not question this, right? So basically, you were getting cheated on, and you cannot question that. In 1919 and the 1930s and 40s, Mao wrote about arranged marriages as being indirect rape, since women cannot therefore consent into marriage. You're not, if you're being forced into a marriage, you're not consenting to that marriage, right? You're not consenting to spending the rest of your life with that individual. Therefore, you can't consent to anything that happens afterwards in the marriage, right? Because you're being forced into this, and because the rules are so strict against women and what they have to do and what they have to obey, they're not consenting to any of this, which is what Mao is trying to say. Once Mao steps into power, the PRC was still a male-dominated system, but there was progress being made to change that. Because it's not like from one day to another, oh my God, everybody stops being sexist. No, that just doesn't happen, right? Just like in the United States, the Civil War ended, and some enslaved individuals were freed. That doesn't mean not slavery, but that doesn't mean racism ended from one day to another. Martin Luther King gives his speech, I have a dream. People think that eliminated racism after Martin Luther King died. It's like, no, like that's not how the world works, right? It's a slow process of eliminating some of these societal ways of thinking. And so society viewed women for hundreds of years as this way in China, and it's not going to change from one day to another just because Mao steps in. But there is progress, right? That can be made. So one of them is, Mao's preaching these things. Women hold up half of the sky. And things such as foot binding were outlawed. Women were officially seen as equal by law, under the government law. So the number of working women also quadrupled as an effect of that, because women can now work and can do the same things as men were doing. From 1949 to 1976, you see it jump from 8% to 32%. That's a big jump. In addition to that, in the 1950s, the PRC introduced the marriage reforms laws, which basically states having mistresses was abolished, arranged marriages were abolished, selling women as property was forbidden and abolished. People who had been forced into marry one another would be allowed to get divorced. So that means if a man and a woman are like, yeah, like we were forced into this, like we don't want this, they would get divorced. All marriage had to be registered with the state in order to ensure that these laws were being practiced. I know it sounds weird to say like we have to register our marriage. Like that sounds a very controlling thing. Guys, we do that here in the United States too, by the way. Okay. You have to sign documentation, and basically the process, whether you change your last name or not, that happens too. And it also is done. Why? Because we need to make sure that we're not having freaking 30-year-old marry 12-year-olds in the United States, just as what's happening in China right here. We're trying to make sure that, people aren't being sold into marriages, right? Next one. Policies, just to continue with that, women, happily accepted this. They're like, hell yeah. And divorced themselves from abusive and unwanted marriages. A lot of these women, like I said, they couldn't question their husbands, and they had to obey them blindly. So if your husband was the worst of the worst of the worst and was beating you and had mistresses and just abusing you in any way, shape, or form, you had to, te tenías que aguantar. You had to put up with it, right? these laws basically said, hey, you don't want to stay married to this man, you don't got to stay married to this man. Women also benefited from Mao's land reform since in the 1950s, women were also granted land in their own name. This went against what had been tradition and the idea that only men in the past were allowed to own and control property. This was short-lived though because of collectivism. So remember, it went from individuals, the peasants having the land, to all of a sudden everybody in the community working the land together. But that also still included women as well. While a lot of these reforms were successful in breaking the old cycles and kind of paving a new way in Chinese society, the cycle of infanticide, just means killing newborn girls, was being continued in regions in China, because historically China had viewed boys as bringing honor. There's a typo right there. Bringing honor with a G. I always like my typing forgets to like add that G. I'm changing it right now. Bringing honor and economic benefits, while girls were seen as a drain on their resources. The idea of female equality was not well received among religious groups in Xiangji, while Muslims dictated that women must be obedient, and other regions in China where Christianity and Confucianism was also enforced that too. Same thing with the Tibetan monks. This could again explain why there was tension between the Chinese Communist Party and those religious groups in those areas that were constantly trying to separate themselves from the communists. Okay, last one. So during Mao's time in power, women only made up 13% of the membership in the CCP. The percentage did rise, though, from 14 to 23 in the National People's Congress. This is partially blamed on the CCP not being aggressive enough in getting rid of that stigma. But also remember that mentality of women are seen less, it didn't go away from one day to another, even with the reform. So it was still hard to push back on these things to do that. Many women in Chinese society still expected women to continue the old norms and focus on just domestic work and stay at home rather than go off to work, right? And a lot of women were still submissive to that because, again, it's still hard to change that mindset. Women did suffer the most under the famine, as many years, they had to make harsh decisions in leaving their children and basically moving on, divorcing their husbands and finding a better husband that might feed you. Additionally, like I said, a lot of women left their kids motherless and vulnerable because they had to leave. They had to leave to find ways to make money. So unfortunately, a lot of women had to be forced into prostitution for those few years. So that's happening. And the last thing that I want to say is, although the Chinese population almost doubled under Mao, even during the famine, leaders would later introduce a way to limit the number of births. This is a very controversial stand, and it's kind of seen as like, what the heck, like we're being limited in how many babies we can have. The peasants weren't limited as much, but the people in the city were, because of overpopulation and crowdedness, but also because a lot of women were being forced to have babies, and so that leads to the law coming in to kind of prevent women from being forced as baby factories, right? Just to make a bunch of babies. So that's it. I'll see you guys later.